The stars had never looked so cold. Katie Morrison stood at the window of the United Earth Council building, watching the sky fill with ships that did not belong to her world. They came in waves, hundreds of them. Their crystalline hulls catching the light of the sun and throwing it back in fractured rainbows. Beautiful and terrible, like a storm made of glass. The Valorian Empire had arrived 3 days ago. Their message had been simple: surrender or die. They had given Earth 72 hours to decide. Katie was 51 years old. She had spent 30 years as a diplomat negotiating trade deals and peace treaties and border disputes. She had talked warlords out of genocide and convinced nations to lay down their weapons. She had believed, perhaps foolishly, that words could solve any problem. Now she stood in silence, watching the end of everything she knew. Behind her, the council chamber erupted in chaos. Representatives from every nation on Earth shouted at each other, their voices rising and falling like waves crashing against rocks. Some wanted to fight. Others wanted to surrender. A few simply sat in their chairs, too shocked to speak. General Marcus Webb pushed through the crowd and stood beside her. He was a large man with gray hair and tired eyes. He had commanded Earth's defense forces for 15 years. He had never lost a battle. He told Katie that they could fight. Earth still had ships, weapons, soldiers willing to die for their home. The Valorians were powerful, but they were not invincible. Nothing was invincible. Katie did not turn from the window. She asked him what the odds were. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he admitted the truth. Maybe 1 in 100. Maybe less. The Valorian fleet outnumbered them 10 to 1. Their weapons were centuries more advanced. Their shields could withstand anything Earth had to offer. Katie nodded slowly. She said that those were not good odds. Marcus agreed that they were not. But he said that sometimes you had to fight anyway. Sometimes honor mattered more than survival. Katie finally turned to face him. Her eyes were calm, almost peaceful. She asked Marcus if he remembered what she had told him when they first met. 20 years ago, during the Mars Rebellion, Marcus frowned, trying to remember. Then his expression changed. He said that she had told him that the best way to win a war was to make your enemy think they had already won. Katie smiled. She said that she had not forgotten. The council voted that night. The decision was unanimous. Earth would surrender to the Valorian Empire without conditions. The news spread across the planet like wildfire. Some people wept. Others raged. Many simply stared at their screens in disbelief, unable to process what they were hearing. The human race, which had survived ice ages and plagues and 2 world wars, was giving up without a fight. Katie ignored the protests and the death threats and the demands for her resignation. She had work to do. She spent the next 48 hours in secret. Meetings with people whose names would never appear in any official record. Scientists, engineers, military officers, intelligence agents. Each conversation was brief, and each ended with the same question. Could they do what needed to be done? Every single one of them said yes. On the morning of the surrender, Katie boarded a shuttle bound for the Valorian command ship. She wore a simple gray suit and carried nothing but a datapad containing the terms of Earth's capitulation. She looked like exactly what she was supposed to look like. A defeated diplomat going to sign away her world's freedom. The Valorian ship was massive, larger than any structure Katie had ever seen. Its halls were carved from something that looked like living crystal. Walls pulsing with soft light in colors that had no human names. Guards escorted her through endless corridors, their forearms folded across their chests, their eyes watching her with cold amusement. High Commander Vexton received her in a chamber the size of a cathedral. He sat upon a throne of black crystal, surrounded by advisors and warriors and servants. His skin was the color of deep water, and his eyes glowed with an inner fire that made Katie's skin crawl. He did not rise when she entered. He simply watched her approach, his expression somewhere between boredom and contempt. Katie stopped at the designated distance and bowed her head. She presented the datapad and spoke the words she had been given. On behalf of the people of Earth. She offered unconditional surrender to the Valorian Empire. Vexathon took the datapad and handed it to an advisor without looking at it. He told Katie that her species was wise to recognize the inevitable. Other worlds had resisted. Other worlds had burned. Katie kept her eyes on the floor. She said that Earth had no wish to burn. Vexen laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. He said that humans were weak, but practical. He said that they would make useful servants. The terms were read aloud. Earth would pay tribute in resources and labor. Human scientists would be conscripted into Valorian research programs. Human soldiers would be disarmed and reassigned to work crews. The planetary defense grid would be dismantled. Any resistance would be met with immediate and overwhelming force. Katie agreed to everything. She signed where she was told to sign. She answered every question with quiet submission. When it was over, Vexathon dismissed her with a wave of his upper right hand. He told her that she would remain on the Valorian capital world as Earth's official representative, a symbol of her planet's obedience. Katie bowed again. She thanked the High Commander for his mercy. As guards escorted her from the chamber, she allowed herself one small moment of satisfaction. The Valorians had not searched her. They had not scanned her neural implant. They had not noticed the microscopic transmitter woven into the fabric of her suit. They had looked at her and seen a beaten woman from a beaten world. They had not seen what she really was. Back on Earth, the dismantling began. Weapons were collected and destroyed. Ships were grounded and stripped for parts. Soldiers traded their uniforms for workers' clothes. To anyone watching, it looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. A conquered planet accepting its fate. But in basements and bunkers and hidden rooms across the globe, other work was happening. Engineers studied captured Valorian technology with desperate intensity. Scientists mapped the aliens' biology, searching for weaknesses. Military strategists planned operations that would not be executed for months or even years. General Marcus Webb oversaw it all from a secret facility beneath the Rocky Mountains. He received Katie's first transmission 3 weeks after the surrender. It was short. Just a few words encoded in a frequency the Valorians had never encountered. The message said that Phase 1 was complete. The enemy believed they had one. Marcus read it twice. Then he allowed himself a smile. The war had just begun. 6 months had passed since the surrender. The Valorian Empire had absorbed humanity with the same efficiency it had absorbed 17 other species before. Humans now worked in mines on distant moons. They staffed research stations and systems whose names they could not pronounce. They bowed their heads and followed orders and did exactly what they were told. Governor Zalmesh had been placed in charge of the human sector. He was old by Valorian standards, his blue skin faded to a pale gray, his movements slow and deliberate. He had governed conquered peoples for 200 years. He knew the patterns of subjugation better than anyone alive. The humans confused him. They were too cooperative, too organized. When new directives came down from the Imperial Council, they adapted within hours. Production quotas were met with mechanical precision. Labor assignments were completed ahead of schedule. There were no protests, no sabotage, no whispered rebellions. Zalmesh had seen conquered species before. He knew how they behaved. First came shock and grief. Then came anger and resistance. Then, finally, came acceptance and submission. The cycle usually took years. The humans had skipped straight to the end. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Grant served as the military liaison between the Valorian administration and the human workforce. He was young for his rank, promoted quickly after the conquest because he spoke the human language and understood their customs. He spent his days reviewing reports and approving work, assignments, and making sure the humans stayed productive. He was the first to notice that something was wrong. It started with small things. A human worker who seemed to know exactly where every security camera was positioned. A technician who fixed a malfunctioning system before the maintenance order was even filed. A labor crew that reorganized itself with perfect efficiency whenever new members were added. Samuel brought his concerns to Governor Zalmesh during a routine briefing. He explained what he had observed. He suggested that the humans might be coordinating in ways the Empire did not understand. Zalmesh listened with the patience of someone who had heard similar fears 1,000 times before. When Samuel finished, the governor waved one of his forehands dismissively. He told Samuel that the young officer was seeing patterns where none existed. Humans were naturally cooperative. Their entire history was built on collaboration and hierarchy. They were simply well-suited to following orders. Samuel accepted the explanation. He returned to his duties, but he could not shake the feeling that he was missing something important. Danny. Carter was a maintenance technician assigned to the administrative complex in the former city of Chicago. He was 34 years old, quiet and unremarkable, the kind of person that eyes slid past without register. He had worked in the complex for 5 months without causing any trouble. One evening, Samuel found him accessing a restricted terminal in a storage room that should have been empty. The lieutenant commander drew his weapon and demanded to know what Danny was doing. Danny turned slowly, his hands raised in the universal gesture of surrender. He smiled, calm and unbothered, and explained that he had been assigned to update the security protocols. There had been a glitch in the monitoring system. He was simply doing his job. Samuel demanded proof. Danny produced a datapad with his authorization codes. The orders were signed by the regional administrator. The timestamps were correct. The security clearances were valid. Samuel checked everything 3 times. He ran the codes through the verification system. He cross-referenced the authorization with the master. Database, everything was in order. He lowered his weapon and told Danny to continue his work. Then he left the storage room, his heart pounding for reasons he could not explain. What Samuel did not know was that the authorization codes were real. The regional administrator had signed those orders just as he had signed hundreds of similar orders over the past 6 months. The Valorians had given humans access to their administrative systems because they needed workers who could maintain them. They had not considered what would happen if those workers decided to learn. Across the Empire, similar scenes played out every day. Human scientists in Valorian laboratories memorized weapon specifications and shield frequencies. Human engineers in shipyards studied crystalline hull designs and propulsion systems. Human workers in communication centers mapped the entire Imperial command structure. They shared information through methods the Valorians had never encountered. Subtle hand gestures that looked like nervous habits. Words hidden in the patterns of casual conversation. Data encoded in the timing of routine maintenance reports. The Empire had surveillance everywhere. They monitored every transmission, every conversation, every movement. But they were looking for what they expected to find. Whispered conspiracies, secret meetings, hidden weapons. They were not looking for a resistance that hid in plain sight. Back on the Valorian capital world, Katie Morrison continued her role as Earth's ambassador. She attended official functions and diplomatic meetings. She answered questions about human culture and history. She smiled and bowed and played the part of a broken woman representing a broken world in private. She received reports from across the Empire. Each message was encoded in a different way. Some came hidden in trade data. Others arrived as fluctuations in power readings. A few were carried by human workers who had memorized information too, sensitive to transmit. The picture they painted was clear. The Valorians had no idea what was coming. General Marcus Webb coordinated operations from his hidden base on Earth. He had aged 10 years in the 6 months since the surrender. Sleep was a luxury he could not afford. Every decision he made could mean life or death for millions of people. He reviewed the latest intelligence reports with his. The Valorians were preparing to integrate humanity more deeply into their empire. Human workers would be deployed to even more sensitive positions. Human scientists would be given access to even more advanced technology. The Empire thought they were being efficient. They had no idea they were handing humans the keys to their own destruction. One of the officers asked Marcus when they would strike. How much longer did they have to wait? Marcus stared at the holographic map of Valorian space. 47 installations had been identified as critical targets. 200,000 humans were now in position to act. Supply caches had been hidden on 100 different worlds. He said that they would wait until they were ready. They would get one chance. If they moved too soon, the Empire would crush them. If they waited too long, the Empire would discover what they were planning. He said that Katie would give the signal when the time was right. Until then, they would keep watching, keep learning, keep pretending to be the obedient servants that Valorians believed them to be. The officer nodded and returned to her station. Marcus turned back to the map. Somewhere out there, among the stars, his people were waiting, playing their parts, preparing for a war that had already begun. He wondered if the Valorians had any idea how dangerous a patient enemy could be. The Valorian capital world had no name that human tongues could pronounce. The locals called it something that sounded like wind passing through crystal caves. Katie Morrison had lived there for 8 months now. She still could not say it properly. Her quarters were comfortable by imperial standards. 3 rooms carved from living stone with windows that looked out over a city of impossible spires. The Valorians provided her with food and clothing and access to cultural materials. They treated her well, as long as she remembered her place. She spent most of her days in isolation. Occasionally, she was summoned to diplomatic functions, where she stood quietly in corners and answered questions about Earth. The Valorians found humans fascinating in the way children found insects fascinating, curious enough to study, but not enough to respect. Katie used every moment to learn. She learned the imperial power structure, mapping the relationships between commanders and governors and council members. She learned the Valorian language, not just the words, but the subtle gestures and color changes that carried hidden meanings. She learned their history, their religion, their deepest fears. She learned that the Valorian Empire had never been defeated. Hi. Commander Vexthon summoned her on the anniversary of Earth's surrender. The invitation arrived through official channels, delivered by a messenger who waited for her response with barely concealed impatience. Katie accepted immediately. She had been waiting for this moment for months. The journey to the High Commander's chambers took her through the heart of the Imperial Palace. Guards watched her every step. Servants stopped their work to stare at the small human woman walking through halls. Designed for giants, Vexthon received her in a private audience chamber. Smaller than the throne room where she had signed the surrender, but no less impressive. Crystalline walls glowed with soft blue light. The air smelled of something sweet and alien. The High Commander sat in a chair that seemed grown rather than built. His forearms rested on the armrests. His glowing eyes tracked her every movement. He told her to sit. Katie took the chair opposite him. It was too large for her body, designed for a species twice her size. Her feet did not touch the floor. Vexthon began speaking about the tribute schedule. Earth had been meeting its quotas, but the Imperial Council wanted more. Additional resources, additional workers, additional scientists for the research programs. Katie listened and nodded and agreed to everything. She had become very good at agreeing. Then Vexthon changed the subject. He said that he had been studying human history. He found it interesting in a limited way. A species that had spent most of its existence fighting itself, only to surrender without resistance when a true enemy arrived. Katie kept her expression neutral. She said that humans were a practical people. Vexthon made a sound that might have been laughter. He said that practical was one word for it. Weak was another. He leaned forward, his glowing eyes fixed on her face. He told her about the other species the Empire had conquered. The Karvesh, who had fought for 3 years before their homeworld was burned. The militant hegemony, who had thrown everything they had against the Valorian fleet and lost. The crystalline minds, who had tried to negotiate and found themselves enslaved anyway. He asked Katie why she thought Earth would be any different. Katie was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked if the High Commander was familiar with a human concept called rules of engagement. Vexthon's eyes flickered. He was not, Katie explained. She said that humans had developed a complex system of rules for warfare. These rules dictated how wars were fought, what weapons could be used, how prisoners should be treated. They had been refined over centuries of conflict. Vexthon waved dismissively. He said that such rules were the mark of a weak species. The Valorian Empire did not handicap itself with honor. They had only strength. Katie nodded slowly. She said that she understood. She also said that humans had simplified their rules over time. They had learned through bitter experience that complicated rules were easily broken. Now they had only two. Vexthon asked what they were, more from amusement than genuine interest. Katie held up one finger. She said that rule number 1 was simple: never start a war. Humans had learned that the aggressor rarely controlled how a war ended. They had learned that the side that struck first often lost everything. Vexthon snorted. He said that Earth had followed that rule, at least. Humans had not started anything. They had simply recognized Valorian superiority. Katie held up a second finger. She said that rule number 2 was even more important. If someone else started a war with humanity, humans would finish it. The chamber was very quiet. Vexthon studied her face for a long moment. Then he laughed, a deep rumbling sound that echoed off the crystalline walls. He told Katie that her species had already lost. The war was over. Earth had surrendered unconditionally. Katie did not respond. The High Commander stood, towering over her. He said that he appreciated her spirit, miss. Guided as it was, he said that humans would serve the Empire well once they fully accepted their place. He dismissed her with a gesture. Katie rose from her oversized chair and bowed in the Valorian style. She thanked the High Commander for his time and his wisdom. As she walked back through the endless corridors of the palace, she allowed herself a small smile. Vexthon thought the war was over. He thought humanity had accepted defeat. He had looked at Earth's surrender and seen submission. He had not seen what it really was. That night, Katie sent a coded message to Earth. It traveled through a dozen relay stations, disguised as routine administrative traffic. By the time it reached its destination, it had been bounced through so many systems that tracing its origin would be impossible. The message was short. It said that the High Commander remained confident. Imperial security was unchanged. The timeline held. General Marcus Webb received the transmission in his underground command center. He read it twice, then turned to his senior staff. He told them that Phase 2 was complete. The enemy still believed they had one. One of the officers asked how much longer they had to wait. Marcus checked the calendar. 3 months. Maybe 4. Human operatives across the Empire needed more time to reach their final positions. Weapons caches needed to be moved closer to their targets. Communication networks needed one final round of testing. He said that Katie would send the signal when everything was ready. Until then, they would continue to play their roles. The officer nodded. She asked what would happen when the signal came. Marcus looked at the holographic map of Valorian space. 47 installations. 200,000 operatives. One chance to strike before the Empire could respond. He said that when the signal came, the Valorians would learn what happened to those who forgot rule number 2. The signal came at midnight. Measured by Earth Standard Time, it was hidden in a routine trade report, buried in columns of numbers that meant nothing to Valorian analysts. But to the humans waiting across 47 worlds, it meant everything. 3 words, repeated in a pattern that could not be coincidental. The night begins, Danny. Carter was working in the Chicago administrative complex when his datapad buzzed with the encrypted notification. He read the message, deleted it, and continued his maintenance rounds without breaking stride. 20 minutes later, he entered a storage room on the building's lowest level. 6 other humans were waiting for him. They had arrived separately, each with a legitimate reason to be there. Maintenance schedules. Equipment inspections. Routine security checks. Danny opened a panel in the wall and removed a case that had been hidden there for 5 months. Inside were weapons, reverse-engineered from Valorian designs and improved with human innovation. They were smaller than the originals, easier to hide, and just as deadly. He distributed them without ceremony. Each person knew their assignment. Each had been training for this moment since the day of the surrender. Danny checked his chronometer. They had 12 minutes before the facility's security systems went offline. 12 minutes before the first phase of the operation began. Similar scenes played out across the Empire. In mining colonies and research stations and military installations, humans who had spent months pretending to be obedient servants revealed their true nature. Mining. Colony 7 went dark at 0347 local time. The human workers there had been stockpiling explosives for 6 months. Small amounts hidden in equipment and personal effects that never triggered security scans. When the signal came, they used those explosives to disable the facility's power grid and communication array. Valorian guards responded immediately, but they were not prepared for what they found. The humans had mapped every patrol route, every response protocol, every weakness in the colony's defenses. They struck from shadows, using weapons the Empire had never encountered and tactics that seemed impossible to counter. By 0400, every Valorian on the colony was unconscious or restrained. Not dead. The humans had been very specific about that. Dead guards created martyrs. Captured guards created leverage. Research Station Keth 4 fell even faster. The human scientists there had been given access to some of the Empire's most advanced technology. The Valorians had thought they were using human intelligence to solve Imperial problems. They had not considered that human intelligence might solve the problem of Valorian rule. Dr. Linda Hayes led the team that seized the station's command center. She was 63 years old, a xenobiologist who had spent her career studying alien life. The Valorians had valued her expertise. They had given her access to research that no human should have seen. She had used that access to identify every vulnerability in Valorian physiology, their sensitivity to certain sound frequencies, their dependence on specific atmospheric conditions, their strange reaction to electromagnetic pulses at particular wavelengths. The station fell in 47 minutes. No one was killed. Governor Zelmash received the first distress signals in his office on Earth. He stared at the reports in disbelief. Mining Colony 7. Research Station Keth 4. Transport Hub Nexus 12. Communications Relay. Sigma 9. They were all going dark, one after another, like lights being extinguished across the Empire. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Grant burst into the office, his face pale with shock. He said that the humans had been planning this for months. Everything they had done since the surrender has been preparation for this moment. Zalmesh demanded to know how this was possible. The humans had been disarmed. Their military had been disbanded. Their technology had been confiscated. Samuel explained what the intelligence reports were revealing. The humans had never stopped fighting. They had simply changed their tactics. Every worker assigned to an Imperial facility had been a soldier in disguise. Every quota met had been a reconnaissance mission. Every act of obedience had been a cover for the real operation. Happening underneath, the governor tried to contact high command on the capital world. The communication channels were filled with distress calls from across the Empire. Commanders screaming for reinforcements, governors reporting the loss of critical installations, military officers describing enemies that seemed to know their every move before they made it. Zalmesh slammed his fist against his desk, cracking the crystalline surface. He demanded to know where the attacks were originating. Who was coordinating this impossible uprising? Samuel pulled up a holographic map of Valorian space. Red icons marked the facilities that had fallen or were under attack. They formed a pattern that spread across the Empire like a disease. He said that the attacks were coming from everywhere. There was no central command to target, no single leader to eliminate. The humans had created a distributed resistance, network that operated independently while working toward common goals. Every installation where humans had been assigned was now a battleground. On the capital world, Katie Morrison watched the chaos unfold from her quarters. She had received confirmation that the first phase was proceeding according to plan. 47 targets had been hit simultaneously. Imperial communications were overwhelmed. The Valorian military was scrambling to respond to threats on multiple fronts. She opened a hidden compartment in her quarters and retrieved a device she had assembled over the past 6 months. It looked like a standard Valorian communication unit, but its internals had been completely rebuilt. She activated it and spoke 3 words. Phase 2 begins. The message traveled. across the Empire in seconds. Carried on frequencies the Valorians had never thought to monitor. It reached hidden bases on 100 worlds. It activated sleeper cells that had been waiting for months, and it told the human fleet that it was time to move. General Marcus Webb stood on the bridge of the flagship Defiant, watching the stars blur as the ship accelerated toward its destination. The vessel was one of 200 that had been hidden in the outer reaches of Earth's solar system. Built in secret from technology, reverse-engineered from captured. Valorian ships, they were smaller than their Imperial counterparts, faster, more maneuverable. And they carried weapons that the Valorians had never seen. Marcus checked the tactical display. His fleet was moving in perfect formation, approaching the first objective at maximum speed. They would arrive in 6 hours. He turned to his communications officer and ordered a channel. Open to all ships. He said that they had waited a long time for this moment. They had played a role that went against everything they believed. They had bowed their heads and followed orders and pretended to be something they were. Not that time was over. He said that the Empire had made a mistake when they came to Earth. They had seen humanity's surrender and assumed they had one. They had not understood what they were really facing. Humans did not give up. They adapted. They planned. They waited for the right moment to strike. And now that moment had arrived. Marcus looked at the stars streaming past the viewport. Somewhere ahead, the Valorian fleet was scrambling to respond to attacks it had never anticipated. Somewhere ahead, the Empire was about to learn a lesson it would never forget. He said that it was time to remind the galaxy why humanity had survived when so many other species had not. It was time to finish what the Valorians had started. High Commander Vexton had never known fear. He had commanded the greatest fleet in the galaxy for 100 years. He had crushed rebellions and conquered worlds and burned civilizations that dared to resist. He was the living symbol of Valorian supremacy. Now he stood on the bridge of his flagship. Watching that supremacy crumble around him, the human fleet had appeared from nowhere. 200 ships, moving in formations that his tactical officers could not predict. They were smaller than Valorian vessels, faster, more agile. They struck at weak points his commanders did not know existed. His fleet was burning. Vexton roared orders at his crew. He demanded reinforcements from the outer sectors. He ordered his remaining ships into defensive positions. He called for status reports from across the Empire. The reports that came back were nightmares. Mining colonies had fallen. Research stations were in human hands. Communication relays had been destroyed. The carefully constructed network that held the Empire together was being torn apart, piece by piece. His tactical officer reported that 40% of the fleet was disabled or destroyed. Shield frequencies had been compromised. Weapon systems were malfunctioning. The humans seemed to know every weakness in Valorian technology. Vexton demanded to know how this was possible. No one could answer him. The main view screen flickered. The face of a human woman appeared, replacing the tactical display. She was older, with tired eyes and steady hands. She wore a military uniform instead of the diplomatic gray he remembered. Katie Morrison had come to collect what was owed. Vexton recognized her immediately. The broken ambassador who had signed away her world, the submissive diplomat who had bowed her head and agreed to every demand. She did not look broken now. He demanded to know what she wanted. He said that the Empire would negotiate. There could be terms. A settlement. Peace was possible if humanity would just stop this madness. Katie's expression did not change. She said that she had a message for the High Commander. She wanted him to understand what was happening and why. Vex single tones. Katie said that when the Valorians came to Earth, they saw a species that was weak and primitive. They saw a civilization that had never left its home system. They saw easy prey. She said that they had not looked deep enough. Humanity had spent 10,000 years fighting itself. They had developed weapons capable of destroying their own world 100 times over. They had turned warfare into an art form, refining their strategies and tactics through endless generations of conflict. When the Valorians arrived, Humans recognized that direct resistance was pointless. Their technology was centuries behind. Their fleet was outmatched. A conventional war would end in extinction, so they did what humans always did when faced with impossible odds. They adapted. Every surrender, every act of submission, every bowed head had been a lie. The humans had studied their conquerors with the same intensity they had once studied each other. They had learned Valorian technology and improved upon it. They had mapped the Empire's weaknesses and planned how to exploit them. They had waited for the perfect moment to strike. Vexthon interrupted. He said that humans were still outmatched. The Empire had thousands of ships, billions of soldiers, resources that humanity could not imagine. This rebellion would be crushed like all the others. Katie shook her head slowly. She said that the High Commander still did not understand. She said that, across the Empire, the species the Valorians had conquered were watching what was happening. They were seeing a fleet of primitive humans tear through the greatest military in the galaxy. They were seeing an empire that had never been defeated begin to fall. They were learning that the Valorians could be beaten. Vexthon felt something cold settle in his chest. He understood finally what the humans had done. They had not just started a rebellion. They had started a revolution, Katie continued. She said that the Valorians had made an error during their first meeting. The High Commander had boasted that his empire did not waste time with honor. They recognized only strength. She said that humans understood strength very well. They had been practicing it for a very long time. Another explosion rocked the flagship. Warning alarms screamed. The tactical officer reported that shield integrity was failing. Hull breaches on multiple decks. Katie said that she had one more thing to tell him. She reminded him of their conversation about the rules of engagement. She had explained that humans had only 2 rules that mattered. Rule number 1, never start a war. Rule number 2, if someone else started a war with humanity, humans would finish it. She said that the Valorians had started this war. When they brought their fleet to Earth, they had demanded surrender and threatened destruction. They had conquered humanity and treated them as slaves. Now humanity was going to finish what the Valorians had begun. The view screen flickered as weapons fire struck the flagship's communication array. Katie's image broke apart and reformed, her voice cutting through the static. She said that the High Commander had forgotten rule number 2. She said that was a mistake. The Valorian Empire would not survive. The screen went dark. Vexthon stared at the empty display for a long moment. Around him, his bridge crew worked frantically to keep the ship functional. Damage reports flooded in from every section. The flagship was dying. He turned to look out the viewport. The battle raged across the stars, Valorian ships burning alongside human vessels. But the humans were winning. Their ships were faster, their tactics smarter, their crews more determined. And beyond this battle, the Empire was collapsing. The conquered species were rising up. The military was fragmenting. The structure that had taken centuries to build was crumbling in a matter of hours. The tactical officer reported that weapon systems were offline. Engines were failing. Life support was compromised. Vexthon closed his eyes. He had conquered 17 star systems. He had crushed every enemy the Empire had ever faced. He had believed, with absolute certainty, that his species was superior to all others. He had been wrong. The final volley struck the flagship's reactor core. The explosion lit the darkness of space like a newborn star. On the bridge of the Defiant, General Marcus Webb watched the Valorian command ship come apart. He felt no satisfaction, only exhaustion. The war was not over. There would be cleanup operations, reconstruction efforts, diplomatic negotiations with newly freed species. But the hardest part was done, Katie. Morrison's face appeared on his private display. She was smiling for the first time since the surrender. She said that Phase 3 was complete. The Valorian fleet was destroyed. The Empire was falling. Marcus asked what came next. Katie said that now came the hard part. Building something better from the wreckage. Helping the conquered species find their freedom. Making sure nothing like this ever happened again. She said that humanity had proven it could win a war. Now they had to prove they could win a peace. Marcus nodded slowly. He turned to look at his crew, humans who had sacrificed everything for this moment. They had pretended to be slaves. They had hidden their strength. They had waited with patience that should have been impossible. And in the end, they had done what humans always did. They had survived. Outside the viewport, the stars burned bright and steady. 17 systems were free tonight. Billions of beings were waking up to a galaxy without Valorian rule. And somewhere, in the ruins of an empire, a lesson was being learned. Never forget rule number 2.